Matthew 22, starting in verse 35. Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him and saying, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said unto him, here he's quoting Deuteronomy 6, verse 5, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it. Here he's going to quote Leviticus 19, verse 18. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Or, as the NLT translates verse 40, the entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. These two commandments do not replace the 10 commandments, they summarize them. You're not loving God with all your heart, soul, and mind if you're taking his name in vain or having other gods. And you're not loving your neighbor as yourself if you're murdering them, you see. And this would be common sense were it not for one commandment that people do not want to keep. One commandment which really does, in a sense, show who really will obey God and who will not. Well, God did say it was a sign. If you read Exodus 31, verse 13, it's a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am the Lord that doth sanctify you. If you go down to verse 17 of Exodus 31, it also calls the Sabbath a sign. And if you read Ezekiel 20, verse 12, and if you read Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 12, and Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 20, it is a sign between God and his people. So it really does show who will obey God and who will not. And because of that, people come up with the most bizarre reasonings to explain away clear Bible verses. It is, in a sense, the test commandment of who really will obey God and who will not. And I think that's why some get bothered by those who claim we need to keep the Sabbath, because it is a reminder to them in their conscience, whether they realize it or not, that they are not fully obeying God. Now, loving God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and loving neighbor as yourself summarizes the commandments, doesn't replace them. Speaking of the Sabbath, we know will be kept in the future. If you go to Isaiah 66, verse 23, and it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord. That hasn't happened yet. So that's why those who claim, well, the 10 commandments are still in effect except for the Sabbath. That's absurd. It will be kept by all flesh, as it says in Isaiah 66, verse 23. Matthew 22, 24, verse 20. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Now, whether or not there was a type of Matthew 24 fulfilled in 70 AD, the primary fulfillment is in the end time. In Matthew 24, if you read verse 14, it says, And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. Verse 27 says, For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Matthew 24 is talking about the end time. And even there we see that the Sabbath is kept. You know, if Christ was going to do away with the need to keep the Sabbath, he wouldn't have answered as he did in Matthew 12. Matthew 12, Matthew chapter 12, go to verse 10. And behold, there was a man which had his hand withered. And they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days, that they might accuse him? And he said unto them, What man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days. If Christ was going to get rid of the need to keep the Sabbath, he wouldn't have answered like that. He would have said, you could do whatever you want on the Sabbath now. You don't have to keep it anymore. By saying it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath, one, he's showing that you can do good on the Sabbath, but just as importantly, he's showing that what is lawful to do on the Sabbath is still important, you see. So summing this up, there are people out there that don't want to keep the Sabbath that will have you believe that you could sin. Sin is a transgression of the law. 1 John 3, verse 4. And if you read James chapter 2, verses 8 through 11, if you break any one of the 10 commandments, you are a transgressor of the law. And some people will actually have you think that that's fine. Romans 6, verse 1. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? We shouldn't sin. We should love neighbor as ourselves and love God with all our heart, soul, and mind. We know that the Sabbath will be kept in the future. Isaiah 66, verse 23, and Matthew 24, verse 20. Read the whole chapter and see if you don't see end time described here, especially when it's talking about the coming of the Son of Man. I've shown you from Exodus 31 and Ezekiel 20 that it is, in a sense, a sign between God and his people. The choice is yours. Have a happy Sabbath. Peace all. Bye-bye.